When you bring to life an experimental IP and it just so happens to take off, it can be difficult to build upon that success. Those were my exact words 4 or 5 months ago when I argued The Crew 2 will never outshine The Crew 1. My entire thesis for that video was that The Crew 1 was both a more memorable experience and more of an absolute joy to just drive around in as an alternative to, driving in real life. Those are just my opinions, but my take on a driving simulator is one where you can get absolutely lost within its world, from the iconic landscapes to the people you meet along the way. The Crew 1 had that in spades, while The Crew 2 just didn't. Well, it wouldn't be long before Ubisoft did what I predicted they someday would, and they delisted The Crew 1 from all online stores with plans to completely shut down the game at the end of March. The only thing about that announcement which surprised me was that The Crew 1 isn't even that old. It won't even get to celebrate a 10th anniversary, and that's a real shame. However, the show must go on. Around the time of that announcement, I had already picked up the Crew Motorfest and began filming. As of the making of this video, not only am I now more than 70 hours into the game, that's 70, I've already gotten to work on the planned episodes for my channel. This of course begs the question, what about The Crew 2? I mean, I did some shorts on it in the fall, but I never gave it an actual playthrough. And in all honesty, I am probably still not going to. It still is not that great of a game. I may begin using it for filming road trip talks, but that's only because I no longer have a choice. Thanks a lot, Ubisoft and Ivory Tower. That all being said, because of how far I've gotten into Motorfest at this point, I do have a lot to say about it, especially considering the fact that, as I also alluded to in my prior video, much of what you do in the Crew Motorfest may be dependent on whether or not you played The Crew 2 in the first place. So, let's talk about it. Before we can even compare the presentation of these 3 games, we have to start with their technical specifications. All of them were available on Xbox One and PS4, but only Motorfest was designed with the Xbox Series and PS5 in mind. If you're a PC player, then this comparison would only apply if you use the same hardware to buy and play all 3 games. But since I'm on an Xbox One X, that's where my metrics are going to come from. So the Crew 1 was 24 gigs in size, had the entire US as a playable map, and ran at a consistent 1080p 30 frames per second. The Crew 2 was around 50 gigs in size, had the entire US but with about 1.5 times the road density of the Crew 1, and it could run at 1080p up to 60 frames per second, or even 4K. Yet it looked a lot worse than the Crew 1 because it had to render more objects from more angles, so every object became a little less textured, a little less detailed, what have you. The Crew Motorfest was completely redesigned, and it of course takes place on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. This means the map is probably about a third of the size of the Crew 2's map, or half the size of the Crew 1's map. This game is around 25 gigs in size, much like the Crew 1. It supports 1080p up to 60 frames per second or up to 4K, much like the Crew 2, and things like object density and textures are improved over the Crew 2, making it honestly a prettier game than the Crew 1 or the Crew 2 combined, which is an achievement. But there's more to it than that even. Some of what makes Motorfest beautiful to drive around is emphasis on color, particularly color contrast. This is something the Crew 1 got right, while the Crew 2 got it way wrong. Like, look at the Crew 2. As of Season 10, they've made greens a bit greener and blues a bit bluer, but it still feels very muted, and it feels like I'm playing City Skylines the racing game. But then you look at Motorfest. I'm using the same car for these clips, the Bentley Mulliner Bacalar. Not only is the Motorfest world more vibrant, but even subtle things like the instrument panel look more legible and more fluid. When you're racing, the barriers and checkpoints in Motorfest are more colorful and contrast the scenery a lot better. And yes, even ignoring that I enhanced the contrast during filming, they just pop out more than the Crew 2's gameplay props ever did. The sunrises, sunsets, and weather effects of Motorfest also pop out way more than weather effects in the Crew 2 ever did. There's more emphasis on warm colors, reds, pinks, oranges, but even things like thunderstorms show off vibrant lightning strikes that you never see the likes of in the Crew 2. It's kind of ironic, because even the Crew 1 had noticeable visual contrasts when the weather would change. You could be driving, it could be sunny, and then the clouds build up, everything gets noticeably darker, grimmer, and then the rain starts to fall. That distinction was all but removed in the Crew 2, and hell, it looks like the rain is independent of the sky. And one more thing in Motorfest's favor, perhaps the most important thing for me, that ridiculous pixel glitch that plagued the Crew 2 is finally completely gone. In fact, I don't think I've really seen any major visual glitches in Motorfest since picking it up. The only issues I've had on Xbox One are frame rate drops, which mainly happen during filming because my One X is showing its age finally. So I don't blame the game for any of that, though your mileage may vary. So really, the bottom line is if you're looking for a game to just drive around in after all the racing is said and done, Motorfest is that game, because the experience of driving feels more alive, and less, well, like a dying world. Anyway, let's move into the presentation. There is something to be said of the direction racing games on the whole have taken since the glory days of the Need for Speed franchise. In the days where street racing was what everyone wanted, it was pure arcade madness, with physics that were nowhere near realistic. But even if it wasn't realistic, the performance decisions you made with your cars actually mattered, and made each car drive a little bit different. Being a street racing game, the Crew 1 went along with the pure arcade feel. You could get improved performance parts for your car, but this meant that buying the same parts for different cars would make them feel about the same. Also, tuning was non-existent. To get around this, the Crew separated cars into classes: street, dirt, performance, raid, and circuit. This meant that cars handled differently depending on the terrain. For instance, performance cars would get absolutely wrecked if driven off-road, while a raid car suffered no losses to speed or handling. It was an interesting system. So they brought it back for the Crew 2. This means at its core, all street cars in the Crew 2 handle similarly, all hypercars handle similarly, all rally raid cars handle similarly, and so forth. But the Crew 2 also tried to allow the player to make those subtle differences from car to car, in order to edge out a little more variety from car to car. Note, I said they tried to. The Crew 2 brought with it affixes and pro tuning. Affixes are basically a perk system. They don't increase raw stats like horsepower, top speed, or handling. Instead, they do things like increase the duration of nitro boost, reduce terrain penalties for going off-road, or make your car slipstream faster around your opponents. It seems like rather intangible stuff, but trust me, you feel it if you're competing in PvP or live summits. They are also in Motorfest and even expanded on in Motorfest, so not much to say there. But then there's pro tuning. Nobody, and I mean nobody, has ever been able to completely figure out pro tuning in the Crew 2. It's all unmarked sliders, some of which don't make any sense when compared to real-life vehicle tuning. Traction control, for instance, is either on or off. It is not a slider, what the hell were they thinking here? And none of these other stats really tell you what direction to move them in. It's best left ignored. But then we get to Motorfest, and it seems like the developers at Ivory Tower finally figured out how to make it do actually what it was supposed to do in the first place. And they did this by completely ripping off the Forza Horizon series, for better or for worse. I'm gonna be a bit more blunt here. At the time of making the script, Motorfest is still only in its second season. It's been experiencing some growing pains as of late, and certain aspects of the game seem to change at random from week to week. This includes the handling model of individual vehicles. For example, it boggles my brain that a car can go from oversteering one week to understeering the next week without any changes being made by the player or any clear explanation from the developers. But thankfully, Pro Tuning is here to save the day, as you can make very minute adjustments that the game thankfully explains what those adjustments will do, and suddenly your handling model is almost tailored to your style of racing. And more than that, they finally fixed things like traction control, stability management, and ABS, being on-off switches with either sport or comfort mode instead of being a random slider. Again, don't know what they were thinking, thankfully it's fixed. But all of that being said, as with Forza Horizon, this also poses a rather serious problem for the crew Motorfest. When races can be won or lost entirely on the tuning setup of the car, it cheapens or even trivializes the player's own input. When you look at Motorfest's own leaderboards, you will see entire lists of players, often hundreds of players, all using the same vehicle with the same performance, affix, and tuning setup. Usually it's whatever the community has deemed the max stat of that car, to where even a novice can put in those figures and just win any event they come across. I still argue that Forza Horizon was worse with this because you could both download cars for free and download other players' tuning setups for free, whereas Motorfest still requires you to grind for cars, parts, and even individual affixes with your own effort. But I won't lie, it does set a dangerous precedent for the future of the game. If the meta of Motorfest becomes go online and follow X instructions to get gold or better in every tournament, that's when the game will stop being competitive to me or fun, because you'd really be better off just letting the game drive itself at that point. Anyway, if in spite of tuning a car you find it just does not handle the way you want it to, well, at least there are still 600 other cars you can buy to play around with. And that is, at least in part, thanks to the work of the crew too. One of the big selling points of Motorfest is that you can import many of your vehicles from the crew too, but I take issue with this for a variety of reasons. I would argue this feature actually is not built into the crew Motorfest, rather it was a feature added specifically to the crew 2 in order to keep it on life support. If you're confused, let me explain how this all works. If you agree to make the handshake between the two games, this becomes a permanent part of both. Anytime you buy a car in the Crew 2, when you boot up the Crew Motorfest, you will get a notification of that vehicle being given to you in Motorfest. However, it promptly loses any performance parts it had on it, as well as any liveries it had on it. Those are not cross-compatible. Visual parts, meanwhile, are. So Motorfest is not actually giving you your cars from the Crew 2. This is just the Crew 2 sending over a ledger or spreadsheet of cars and their associated visual unlocks that Motorfest reads from and promptly gives you a generic copy of. And the unfortunate problem is this does not go both ways. If you buy a Crew 2 car within Motorfest, then log into the Crew 2, the car you bought is not going to be there. But there is no reason why it couldn't be there if the game is just using a ledger system anyway, because the Crew 2 knows what it is sending to the Motorfest servers. So theoretically, Motorfest would just need to send back a similar ledger to the Crew 2 servers, and the Crew 2 would magically be able to give you the stock versions of selected cars you've earned in your Motorfest playthrough. So why does any of this matter? 2 words: live summits. Summits were of course the bread and butter of the Crew 2's long game, so they make a return in Motorfest. What you'll notice, however, is that many of the required cars for the summits were cars you can acquire in the Crew 2. And even the rewards are cars you can just acquire in the Crew 2. Ubisoft is doing this because there are a lot of players who picked up Motorfest and never played the Crew 2 before this. To make it even easier, they even bundle these cars so they are 30 to 40% cheaper than if you were to buy them in the Crew 2. So, which would you rather do? Farm approximately $1.5 million in the Crew 2 for 3 cars, and then port those 3 cars into Motorfest, or buy those same 3 cars outright in Motorfest for around $800,000? Well, the answer is complicated. Making $1 million in the Crew 2 can be done in as little as an hour, especially if you're high rank and have lots of FXs for money multiplication. Making money in the Crew Motorfest is a lot harder. It can take 3 or 4 hours just to make that same $1 million, but if you've never played the Crew 2 before Motorfest, are you really going to want to spend 100 hours playing that game just to get to the point where farming money is easy? When it gets down to it, interoperability with the Crew 2 is really just a gimmick. I only exported 60 cars from the Crew 2 into Motorfest when I started the game. Since then, I've ported about 20 more at the most. I've driven maybe 10 of them regularly. Off the top of my head, the modern-day Corvettes, the McLaren 12C, the Nissan Black Gold, that's not what it's called in-game, long story, and the Bugatti Voyager Noir are the Crew 2 cars I've used the most in Motorfest, and that's because... why would you ever want to drive cars from the Crew 2 anyway, when Motorfest outright gives you so many exclusive cars that are infinitely better? Motorfest is divided into playlists centered around car themes. You have a playlist for JDM culture, a playlist for electric cars, a playlist for motorcycles, and so forth. At the end of every playlist, you unlock a car unique to that playlist, and it's a car that was never featured in the Crew 2, and likely never will be. But that's not all. After you've beaten a playlist, there are challenges that require you to use other cars from that playlist. So you can buy bundles of cars, nearly all of which are also Motorfest exclusive. Meaning that after beating 15 or more playlists and buying the challenge cars for them, that's over 45 Motorfest exclusive vehicles in my garage, almost as many vehicles as what I sent over from the Crew 2 anyway. Some of my most used Motorfest exclusive cars include the Porsche Taycan and Lotus Avaya from the Electric Cars playlist, but also the Mitsubishi Lancer models which were featured in the Made in Japan and Drift Challenge playlists. Like, I'm still happy I didn't have to rebuy some of my Crew 2 cars, but it wouldn't exactly have set me back that many hours if I had to. And that causes another issue with the Crew 2. If I don't have these vehicles in the Crew 2, then I'm obviously not going to play the Crew 2 since they aren't there. And this is where you say, but Maddie, it still has all those cars you just talked about, the Corvettes, the Voyager Noir, and so on. Yes, I do have those cars. And I even have the cars I bought in the Crew 2 specifically for the Motorfest summits. But that's only because Motorfest wasn't around at the time I bought the Crew 2. If you have never played the Crew 2, I would still argue you shouldn't play it now, and that's for one really damning reason. It's no secret that a game lives or dies by its longevity and its replayability. The Crew 1 was a short game, as evidenced by my playthrough of it being summarized in as little as 5 episodes. That said, there was major appeal in replaying that story mode more than once. It also helped that you were able to replay 90% of the story events without having to start a new game, something that Need for Speed could certainly learn from. But then you had the Crew 2, which initially told 4 stories but made them entirely open-ended. You could play events in any order, and you only needed to beat 50% of them to challenge the 4 story bosses and beat the game. This meant there were entire events that players would just never play. And it gets worse. After you played an event the first time, there was no incentive to replay that event unless grinding for money or climbing up the leaderboard. Events had 3 difficulties, normal, hard, and ace, but this only increased winnings for that event. It did nothing to change the story of that event. Motorfest needed a way to correct this problem, and they were incredibly creative, like to the point of earning mad respect. So when you play the events of a playlist for the first time, you were given loaner cars for the entire playlist, and you have to complete all the events in their exact order. Only after you have done this can you replay those events with any car of your choosing. But why would you do this? Challenges. Challenges compel the player to replay playlist events using specific cars and doing specific tasks. For example, a challenge might require you to complete an event at night during a lightning storm with one of the electric cars you won or bought during Electric Odyssey. Another challenge might require you to play an event from another playlist altogether with some sort of modifier such as clean driving. And if you just want to play, you can set up all the custom events that you want. You choose the location, the time of day, the weather, the modifiers, and any class of vehicle. Now, in the Crew 2, events were locked to vehicle classes. You couldn't, for example, use a hypercar in a rally race or a drift car in a drag race. But in Motorfest, you can. You have the power. The game even encourages you to do this when it throws events at you where you are the only street class car and your opponents are all hypercars, or you're the only drift class car and your opponents are all street race cars. The only thing the Crew 2 has going for it now is the Community Race Creator, which was added in Season 9, but Motorfest will probably get one too eventually, and that's probably the point where the Crew 2 will completely stop being relevant. I wasn't expecting this video to be as long as my other video, but here we are. ultimately, where was I going with this anyway? I guess the point I wanted to get across from this is that I feel Ubisoft is only shuttering the Crew 1 to push people onto the Crew 2, because their plans to integrate the Crew 2 into Motorfest failed miserably. If you've never played the Crew 2, do not start now. Just play Motorfest. It is almost as good as the Crew 1. Thank you so much for watching. May the Crew 1 rest in peace. May the Crew 2 share the same fate in 2027.